Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about regenerative farming and how it can help with climate change.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and there's a lot of buzz around it lately.
Definitely. And the article we're looking at today is from Yes Magazine called The Climate Solution Right Beneath Our Feet.
Right beneath our feet. I like that.
Yeah, it's catchy, right?
Yeah.
So the article really dives into how soil can actually play a major role in fighting climate change.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. We're always talking about reducing emissions, but what about the carbon that's already in the atmosphere?
Exactly.
This article talks about how we can actually pull that carbon out of the air and store it in the ground.
And that's where regenerative farming comes in.
Exactly.
But before we get into the solutions,
Yeah.
I think it's important to understand the problem.
Yeah, for sure. The article paints a pretty stark picture of what's happening to our soil.
It says that if soil degradation continues at its current rate, we could lose all our fertile soil in just 60 years. 60 years. That's not very long.
No, it's not. It's a pretty alarming thought, right?
Yeah, definitely makes you think about the future of food
And the planet.
yeah, exactly.
But the article doesn't just focus on the doom and gloom, it also offers a lot of hope.
Yeah, for sure. It highlights how soil can be a powerful carbon sink.
A carbon sink, so what does that mean exactly?
Well, basically it means that soil can absorb and store carbon from the atmosphere, preventing it from contributing to climate change.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. So plants pull carbon dioxide from the air during photosynthesis,
Right.
and then that carbon ends up in the soil.
Exactly. And healthy soil can hold on to that carbon for a long time.
So regenerative farming is all about building up that healthy soil, right?
Yeah, it's a holistic approach to agriculture that focuses on restoring and revitalizing soil health.
So instead of depleting the soil through conventional practices like intensive tilling and using lots of chemicals,
Right.
regenerative farming actually builds it up.
Yeah.
And the article talks about all sorts of different practices that can be used, like composting, cover cropping, no-till farming, and incorporating livestock grazing.
Yeah, there's a lot of different techniques, but the underlying principle is the same. It's all about working with nature to create a healthy and balanced ecosystem.
And the article highlights some pretty amazing examples of regenerative farming in action.
Oh yeah, like the Marin Carbon Project in California.
Right. They found that just spreading a thin layer of compost on rangelands can significantly increase carbon sequestration.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And their calculations suggest that treating just a small percentage of California's rangelands with compost could offset the emissions of millions of cars.
Millions of cars. Wow, it's a huge impact.
Yeah, it really shows the potential of regenerative practices to make a real difference.
And then there's Gabe Brown, the rancher in North Dakota who was facing bankruptcy.
Oh yeah, I remember reading about him.
He decided to try these regenerative practices, and he ended up completely eliminating synthetic fertilizers, fungicides, and pesticides.
And now his farm is thriving.
Exactly. He's a great example of how working with nature can be both good for the environment and good for business.
Yeah, his story is really inspiring.
Definitely.
It shows that there's a real alternative to conventional agriculture and that it can actually be more profitable in the long run.
I'm really fascinated by all this, but I have to admit, I'm also wondering,
that.
if it's so beneficial, why isn't everyone doing it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something we'll definitely be exploring in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good. I'm definitely looking forward to it. So we were just talking about Gabe Brown and his success with regenerative farming, and it makes you wonder, why isn't everyone doing this if it works so well?
Right. It seems like a no-brainer, but there are definitely some barriers to adoption.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, it requires a pretty big mindset shift.
Okay. How so?
Well, many farmers have been practicing conventional agriculture for generations. Their fathers and grandfathers before them.
Yeah.
So it can be really tough to break away from those traditions and embrace new approaches.
Especially when it comes to something as fundamental as how you grow food.
Exactly. It's not just about learning a new technique. It's about changing your whole perspective.
On your relationship with the land.
Yeah, exactly. And on how food is produced.
So what does that mindset shift actually look like in practice?
Well, regenerative agriculture really requires farmers to become keen observers of their land.
Okay.
They need to understand the complex interactions between soil, plants, animals, and the environment.
So it's not just about following a set of rules, it's about really understanding the ecosystem.
Right, and being able to adapt to the specific conditions of your land.
That sounds like it takes a lot of knowledge and skill.
It does. But luckily, there's a growing network of organizations and researchers who are providing education and support to to farmers who want to transition to regenerative practices.
That's good to hear. So there are resources available.
Definitely organizations like Kiss the Ground, the Rodale Institute, the Savory Institute, they're all doing great work in this area.
And are there any government programs or policies that are helping to promote regenerative agriculture?
There are some, but there's definitely room for improvement, I think.
So we need more support from policymakers.
Yeah, for sure. Things like financial incentives for farmers who adopt regenerative practices, research funding to further develop these techniques.
That makes sense because even with the support and resources, it's still a big leap for a farmer to make, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's not a quick fix. It takes time, and there can be challenges along the way.
Like what?
Well, for example, dealing with pests and weeds without using conventional pesticides can be tricky.
Right, because in regenerative agriculture, you're trying to work with the natural ecosystem.
Exactly. So you have to find ways to manage those challenges without disrupting that balance.
And speaking of balance, the article mentions the meat debate and how some people think that livestock grazing is inherently harmful to the environment.
Right. That's a big topic, and it's important to be nuanced in our understanding.
Yeah, because I've heard that properly managed grazing can actually be beneficial for the soil.
That's true. When done correctly, grazing can mimic the natural patterns of herbivores and actually help to improve soil health.
So it's not just about eliminating livestock, it's about integrating them into the farm ecosystem in a way that's sustainable.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance.
And I think that brings us to a really important point, which is the connection between regenerative agriculture and our food choices.
Right. As consumers, we have a lot of power to influence the food system.
So by choosing to buy food from farmers who practice regenerative agriculture, we can actually encourage more farmers to adopt these practices.
Exactly. It's about voting with our dollars and supporting businesses that align with our values.
So things like looking for labels like certified organic, regenerative organic, certified biodynamic.
Yeah, those are all good indicators that the food has been produced in a way that's good for the environment.
And shopping at farmers markets or joining CSA programs.
Exactly. Those are great ways to connect with local farmers and support sustainable agriculture.
All right, so we've talked about the benefits of regenerative agriculture, the challenges to adoption, and how consumers can support this movement. But I'm curious about the bigger picture.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, we've talked about the impact on individual farms and the environment.
Right.
But how might regenerative agriculture impact the entire food system?
That's a great question, and I think it's something we'll explore in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so before the break, we were talking about the big picture, how regenerative agriculture could impact the whole food system, not just individual farms.
Right, yeah, it's a pretty big question.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think regenerative agriculture really has the potential to revolutionize the way we think about food production.
Okay, in what way?
Well, imagine a food system that's not based on exploitation, where the focus isn't on squeezing every last drop of profit out of the land, but on actually building soil health, on enhancing biodiversity.
Creating a more resilient system.
Yeah.
Exactly. A system that can actually nourish people and the planet for generations to come.
That's a pretty inspiring vision.
It is, and I think it's achievable.
Okay, but how do we actually get there?
Well, it's going to take a lot of work, obviously, but I think one of the most important things is education.
Education of?
Both farmers and consumers.
Okay, so farmers need to learn about the benefits and the practicalities of regenerative practices.
Right, and consumers need to understand why it's so important to support those farmers.
Yeah, because ultimately it's consumer demand that drives the market.
Exactly. So if people are willing to pay a little bit more for food that's produced in a sustainable way,
then more farmers will be incentivized to adopt those practices.
Right.
And beyond education, are there other things that need to happen to make this transition?
Oh, yeah, for sure. We need more research and innovation to further develop regenerative practices and technologies.
Okay, so we need to keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Yeah, and we need to make sure that those innovations are accessible to farmers all over the world. Right, because regenerative agriculture shouldn't just be something that's practiced by a small group of elite farmers.
Exactly. It needs to be a viable option for everyone.
And that brings us to the issue of economics, right? Because transitioning to regenerative agriculture can be expensive.
Yeah, it can require some upfront investments, and there might be a period of adjustment before you start seeing the full benefits.
So how do we support farmers during that transition?
Well, I think that's where government policies and financial incentives can play a big role.
Okay, so things like subsidies or tax breaks for farmers who adopt regenerative practices.
Exactly. And investments in infrastructure that makes it easier for farmers to access markets for regenerative products.
Yeah, because we need to make sure that regenerative agriculture is not only good for the environment, but also economically viable for farmers.
Right. It has to be a win-win situation.
And I think that's a good place to wrap up our deep dive.
Yeah, I think so.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From the basics of regenerative agriculture to its potential to transform the entire food system.
And it's clear that this is a really important topic with huge implications for the future of our planet.
So what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this conversation?
I hope they come away with a sense of hope and empowerment.
Okay.
Regenerative agriculture is not just some pie-in-the-sky idea. It's a real and practical solution to some of the biggest challenges we face.
Yeah, climate change, food security, environmental degradation.
Exactly. And each of us has a role to play in making this transition happen.
Whether it's through our food choices, our advocacy, or our support for farmers who are leading the way.
That's right. We can all be part of the solution.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining me today for this deep dive into regenerative agriculture.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.